They say blood is thicker than water, but they never tell you how easily blood can run cold, turning into shards of ice that pierce the very heart of a family. My father, Arthur Sterling, didn't build an empire by being kind. He built it by being a shark in a sea of smaller, weaker fish. Growing up, I wasn't just his daughter. I was his shadow, his most loyal soldier, and eventually the silent engine that kept Sterling Logistics running at peak performance. I remember being 12 years old and sitting in the corner of his office, watching him dismantle competitors with a single phone call. While other girls were playing with dolls, I was learning how to read profit and loss statements and how to spot a lie in a vendor's eyes. I sacrificed my weekends, my social life, and the entirety of my 20s to ensure the Sterling name remained at the top of the global food chain. I worked through pneumonia, I skipped vacations, and I stayed until the janitors turned off the lights, all because I believed in the legacy. I thought I had earned his respect through my merit and my tireless dedication. I thought, for once, I was seen as an equal, a successor, a human being. But the corporate world is a cold place, and apparently my father's heart was the coldest corner of it. It was a rainy Tuesday when I walked into his office, my heart fluttering with a mix of nerves and pure, unadulterated joy. I was holding a small white envelope, the kind that contained a secret capable of changing a life forever. I had just come from my 12-week scan, and for the first time in my career-driven life, I felt a purpose that transcended logistics and bottom lines. I sat across from him, looking at the man who had raised me, and I placed the sonogram photo on his heavy mahogany desk. I waited for a smile, a congratulatory remark, or even a simple nod of acknowledgement. Instead, the warmth in his eyes vanished instantly, replaced by the same calculated, predatory coldness he used for hostile takeovers and aggressive negotiations. He didn't even pick up the picture. He didn't look at the tiny life that was his own future grandson. He simply stared at me as if I had just presented him with a bankruptcy filing. "This is a distraction, Elena," he said, his voice as flat as a dial tone. He leaned back in his leather chair, the springs creaking like a warning. "A company of this magnitude cannot be led by someone whose priorities are divided by diapers and doctor appointments. You know the pace we keep here. You know the demands of the board. You've become a liability the moment you decided to prioritize your personal whims over the stability of this firm." I laughed nervously, my breath catching in my throat, thinking it was a joke, a cruel, outdated test of my resolve. I expected him to break character and tell me he was proud, but his face remained a mask of stone. He reached into his top drawer and pulled out a pre-prepared folder. He hadn't just reacted, he had planned this. He had known, or perhaps he had sensed the shift in me, and he had prepared the execution. He slid the folder across the desk toward me. It was a severance package, drafted with clinical precision. "I'm relieving you of your duties, effective immediately," he continued, as if he were discussing a minor shipping delay. My own father was firing me while I was pregnant, in the very office where I had billed 80-hour weeks to save his reputation during the 2022 supply chain crisis. The air in the room felt thick, suffocatingly heavy. I looked at the man who had taught me to ride a bike and how to negotiate a $1 million contract, and I realized he saw no difference between me and a piece of depreciating equipment. To him, I was a tool that had suddenly lost its edge. I felt the sting of tears threatening to blur my vision, but I refused to let them fall, not in front of him, not today. I took a deep breath, the scent of his expensive cigars filling my lungs, and I felt a strange, cold clarity wash over me. I realized that the loyalty I had given him was a currency he didn't value. I stood up slowly,
my hand instinctively resting on my stomach. The betrayal was so deep, it felt physical, a sharp ache that radiated through my spine. But as I looked at the severance papers, I noticed he hadn't even looked at the fine print, the very print I had helped draft months ago when we were updating corporate policy. He was so arrogant, so sure of his power over me, that he assumed I would slink away quietly into the shadows of motherhood. He thought I was broken. He thought he had ended my career with a stroke of a pen. I tucked the sonogram into my purse, straightened my blazer, and looked him dead in the eye. For the first time in my life, I didn't see a giant. I saw a man who had grown old and predictable. I didn't argue. I didn't beg for my job. Instead, I let a slow, deliberate smile spread across my face. It wasn't a smile of happiness. It was a smile of war. He had no idea what was coming next. He had taught me everything I knew about being a shark, and now he had just invited one into his own waters.
I didn't cry as I stepped out of that mahogany-paneled tomb, though the weight of the box in my arms felt heavier than any logistics crisis I had ever managed. I didn't beg for my position, nor did I remind him of the countless nights I had slept on the office sofa to ensure a merger went through while he was vacationing in the Hamptons. Instead, I looked at the man who raised me, the man who had just traded his daughter for a cleaner balance sheet, and I let a slow, deliberate smile spread across my face. It was a smile that confused him. I saw the flicker of uncertainty in his cold eyes, a momentary glitch in his predatory composure. He thought my smile was a sign of shock, or perhaps a submissive acceptance of my new role as a discarded relic. He had no idea that my smile was the first shot fired in a war he wasn't prepared to fight. He saw a pregnant woman as a liability, a slowing machine that needed to be replaced before it broke down. I saw a titan who had grown too comfortable, too arrogant, and far too predictable. As I walked out of the building for the last time, the heavy glass doors hissed shut behind me like a guillotine. But I didn't feel executed. I felt liberated. The revolution didn't start with a public tantrum or a messy lawsuit. It started in the quiet, sterile glow of my home office during the early hours of the morning when the rest of the world was dreaming. For the next 6 months, while my belly grew and the physical toll of pregnancy began to set in, my mind became a razor-edged weapon. Arthur had forgotten one crucial detail during his cold-blooded execution. I wasn't just his shadow. I was the architect of his internal systems. I knew every vendor who felt squeezed by his aggressive margins, every client who was tired of being treated like a number, and every middle manager who was terrified of his temper. I didn't need his massive warehouses or his fleet of branded trucks to compete. In the modern age, the real power isn't in the steel, it's in the data and the relationships. I sat at my desk, my feet swollen and a heating pad against my back, and began to reach out to the contacts I had nurtured for a decade. I didn't ask for favors, I offered solutions. I told them about NovaStream, a boutique logistics firm that prioritized precision and human connection over the bloated, archaic bureaucracy of sterling logistics. One by one, the pillars of my father's empire began to vibrate. I worked with a quiet, frantic energy, fueled by a mixture of maternal instinct and the cold, hard desire for justice. I reached out to the West Coast distributors first, the ones who had complained for years about my father's rising convenience fees. When they heard my voice on the other end of the line, they didn't see a pregnant woman out of work. They saw the person who had actually kept their shipments moving for 10 years, while Arthur took the credit. I offered them a more transparent routing system, one I had designed in secret during my final months at Sterling, realizing even then that the company was stagnating. My father had taught me how to be a shark, but he had failed to realize that sharks don't care about bloodlines when they sense a predator has grown old and slow.
As the months passed, my small home office transformed from a nursery in progress into a high-tech war room. I was building a digital ghost fleet that was leaner, faster, and infinitely more loyal to me than his staff ever was to him. Every time I felt the baby kick, it felt like a reminder that I wasn't just fighting for my pride, I was building a future that Arthur Sterling could never touch. He thought he had ended my career, but all he had really done was remove the only person standing between him and the consequences of his own hubris.
The momentum of a falling giant is a terrifying and beautiful thing to behold from the outside, especially when you are the one who pulled the rug. By the time I reached my 8th month of pregnancy, the tremors within Sterling Logistics had turned into a full-scale earthquake. I sat in my nursery, surrounded by half-assembled cribs and soft blue blankets, but my lap was occupied by a high-end laptop that was currently displaying the real-time collapse of my father's regional dominance. One by one, the major accounts began to flip. These weren't just small vendors, these were the heavy hitters, the legacy clients who had been with the Sterling name for 30 years. They didn't leave because of a flashy marketing campaign. They left because I offered them a proprietary routing software that bypassed my father's bloated middle management fees, a system I had finished coding while nursing morning sickness and backaches. Arthur finally realized that the distraction he had fired wasn't just a disgruntled former employee. She was a ghost in his machine. In a desperate, predictable move, he attempted to unleash his legal team on me, slapping me with a massive lawsuit for breach of contract and non-compete violations. I remember receiving the digital summons while I was folding tiny onesies. I didn't panic. I didn't even call a lawyer right away. Instead, I poured myself a glass of sparkling water and smiled at the sheer irony of it all. 3 years prior, when Arthur was too busy chasing a trophy wife in the Mediterranean, he had tasked me with the boring legal restructuring of the company's executive contracts. I had inserted a specific, quiet loophole regarding intellectual property created outside of company hours using personal hardware, a clause he had signed without a second glance because he trusted his loyal shadow to protect him. He had signed his own death warrant while thinking he was merely approving a routine HR update. The lawsuit was dead before it even reached a judge's desk. As my due date approached, the industry chatter reached a fever pitch. NovaStream wasn't just a startup anymore. It was the preferred partner for the new era of logistics. My father's stock price began to hemorrhage, dropping 15% in a single week as shareholders realized the Sterling brand was nothing but an empty shell without the woman who had actually managed the operations. The man who had mocked my divided priorities was now finding his own priorities entirely consumed by damage control and desperate boardroom meetings. The climax of this silent war happened on a rainy Thursday morning, the same morning my water broke. I was being wheeled into the delivery room, clutching a nurse's hand with one hand and my smartphone with the other, watching the live ticker of the New York Stock Exchange. Just as the first heavy contractions began to take hold, a notification flashed across my screen. The board of directors at Sterling Logistics had called for an emergency vote of no confidence against Arthur. The irony was poetic. As I was laboring to bring new life into the world, my father was watching his life's work expire on a cold boardroom table. Hours later, exhausted and overwhelmed with a primal sort of love I had never known, I held my son, Leo, for the first time. The room was quiet, filled only with the soft, rhythmic beeping of the monitors. Then my phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a text message from a number I hadn't saved, but knew by heart. "You destroyed me," it read. No greeting, no inquiry about his grandson, just a bitter accusation from a man who still couldn't take responsibility for his own short-sightedness.
I looked down at Leo's tiny, perfect face, his fingers curling around my thumb, and I whispered the truth into the silence of the hospital room. We didn't destroy him, Leo. We didn't have to. We simply outgrew a man who was too small to see the future standing right in front of him. I put the phone on silent and went to sleep, knowing that when I woke, I wouldn't just be a mother, I would be the most powerful woman in the industry. The air in the Sterling building always smelled of expensive floor wax and old, cold ambition. But as I walked through the lobby 3 weeks later, the atmosphere felt different. It felt like a house that had been vacated by a ghost. I wasn't the shadow anymore. I was the sun around which the remaining staff now gravitated. I pushed a high-tech, sleek stroller with one hand, my son Leo sleeping soundly inside, while my other hand held a leather briefcase that contained the finality of an era. The security guards, the same men who had lowered their eyes in shame the day I was fired, now stood at attention, rushing to hold the doors open for me. I didn't need a badge to get to the top floor this time. The board of directors had already cleared my path. Every step I took toward the executive suite was a rhythmic echo of the months of silent planning, the late-night coding sessions, and the unwavering belief that a mother's strength is the most underestimated force in the corporate world. When I reached the mahogany doors of the CEO's office, I didn't knock. I pushed them open and found my father sitting in the same high-backed leather chair where he had once dismantled my life. He looked smaller than I remembered. The suit that used to look like armor now hung loosely on his shoulders, and the silver in his hair seemed to have lost its luster, turning a dull, defeated gray. He was staring out the window at the city he no longer conquered. Without a word, I moved across the room and placed a new photograph on the desk, right where the sonogram had been months prior. It was a picture of Leo, wide awake and vibrant. Arthur didn't look at it at first. He kept his gaze fixed on the skyline until the silence became too heavy to bear. "The buyout went through an hour ago," he whispered, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "NovaStream owns 51% of the debt. You didn't just compete with me, Elena. You hunted me." I sat in the guest chair, the very chair where he had handed me a severance package while I was vulnerable, and I crossed my legs with a calm, predatory grace. "I didn't hunt you, Dad," I replied, my voice steady and devoid of the bitterness I thought I would feel. "I simply applied the lessons you taught me. You told me that a company of this magnitude cannot be led by someone with divided priorities. You were right. My priority was the survival of my family, and that gave me a focus you haven't had in decades. You got comfortable. You thought loyalty was a given rather than something earned. You saw a pregnant woman as a weakness, but you forgot that a mother is the only creature capable of doing two things at once, nurturing a life and protecting it at all costs." He finally turned to look at the photo of Leo, and for a fleeting second I saw a flash of regret in his eyes, not for the cruelty he showed me, but for the realization that he had missed the chance to be on the winning team. I pulled the final acquisition documents from my briefcase and slid them across the desk. It was the retirement package I had drafted. It was generous, far more generous than the severance he had offered me. But it came with one non-negotiable condition: his immediate and total exit from the industry. He picked up the gold pen, the one I had given him for his 60th birthday, and signed his name with a trembling hand. As he finished, I stood up and moved behind the desk. He hesitated, then stood, vacating the seat of power for the last time. I sat down, the leather still warm from his presence, and looked at the man who had fired me. "I told you that day I smiled because you had no idea what was coming next," I said softly. "Now you know. You fired a daughter, but you gave birth to your most formidable rival. And today your rival is giving you the one thing you never gave her, a way out." He walked to the door without looking back, a relic of a dying age. I looked down at Leo, who was just starting to stir in his stroller, and I realized that the best revenge isn't just winning, it's proving that the very thing they thought would hold you back was actually the engine that drove you to the top.